Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to start a new unit diving into period 7 of the APUSH U.S. History curriculum, beginning to talk about the rise of American imperialism in the context of the Spanish-American War. So we're going to kick off this new era with the United States taking its place on the world stage, facing off against some old European powers, and to some degree emulating the practices of Europeans. So today, Spanish-American War, the extent to which the United States is an imperial country now versus to what extent we were before, and the arguments for and against American imperialism. So let's dive into this incredibly difficult and sticky topic. During this time period, of course, European countries were establishing quote-unquote colonies around the world, building these massive imperial structures in order to finance their industrial might, provide natural resources, and of course, increase their national prestige. The United States, to some extent, had already begun its period of imperial expansion, depending on how you feel about westward expansion and manifest destiny, and we had already begun acquiring some overseas territory not contiguously connected to the United States with the purchase of Alaska, back in the last unit. But as far as actually settling and incorporating this territory in, we hadn't really seen it yet. And the United States really hadn't gotten involved with this whole imperialism thing, at least up until this point. But the rise of Jingoism really started pushing many Americans to start to argue that creating this imperial structure, creating colonies and capturing colonies, were both essential to our overseas trade, markets, and access to raw materials, but also really important for the United States to sort of take their place amongst the great nations of the world, because the great nations of the world were imperial nations. Jingoism is a type of sort of hyper-nationalism or chauvinism that was popular during this time period. And so we started to see the rise of American Jingos arguing for, increased American role and presence around the world. And we started to see, the philosophies of Arthur Thayer Mahan, who wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, basically arguing that if you're going to be a great nation, you can't be limited to your own sort of national lands. You need to have a powerful blue water navy in order to project power abroad. So the two most noted American Jingos are, of course, Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, and then Theodore Roosevelt, who at this point is the governor of New York, but eventually he's going to run for vice president and then, of course, become president of the United States eventually. Both of them were advocates for the building of this new battleship fleet. As you hopefully remember from last unit, we started this really under, Garfield and Chester A. Arthur. But this idea that you need to have this modern navy to be a great power became one that was very seductive for a lot of Americans as they saw themselves as a great nation and really wanted to be viewed on equal footing with these European powers who were creating massive empires during this time period. During the Cleveland administration, we saw the Venezuelan crisis, in which the United States saw the first major test of the Monroe Doctrine. Venezuela was, one of these newly independent Latin American countries. I guess calling it newly independent is not exactly accurate, considering, they've been independent for 60 years. But many of these Latin American countries struggled getting into debt with European countries, which they then were unable to sort of pay off. And so the Venezuelan crisis was when Venezuela started defaulting on their debts to both England and Germany. And we started to see England and Germany flirting with the idea of potentially invading and taking over Venezuela to force them to pay their debts. The Cleveland administration, so this made us very uncomfortable, that Europeans might be gaining sort of a foothold again in the Americas. And so the Cleveland administration forced them to back down, basically forbid European countries from really intervening in these Latin American countries. And this is the first time that we really see the Monroe Doctrine being enforced, with the Cleveland administration saying, it might, if you try to invade Venezuela, this might lead to a military confrontation with the United States, which neither Germany and England really wanted over the issue of Venezuelan debts. And so, relevant to us because this is the first time that we really see the enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine moving forward. And the United States is finally able to flex the muscles that they sort of articulated way back in the era of good feelings. Hawaii is another issue here because Hawaii, as you hopefully know, is a tropical island in the middle of the Pacific. It's great for fruit and sugarcane cultivation. And Americans had begun to sort of invest in Hawaii during this time period. And so we started to see American capital flowing to Hawaii in order to establish large plantations to profit from the island's, fertile soil, fertile volcanic soil, and really good climate. And this led to a confrontation between the government of Hawaii, which was a monarchy, and the Dole family of the Dole Fruit Company, which owned these large plantations. The battle was over. So the previous king of Hawaii had allowed the Dole Company to come in and had allowed them to establish these plantations and hire workers, things like that. But the new queen, Lialakalani here, decided that she wanted to put in place some workplace protections for Hawaiians to cut down on some of what she saw as abuses by the Dole Fruit Company. And there was also this question of growing Japanese influence in the island, because during this time period, there were also lots of Japanese laborers moving in. And so this made the United States very concerned that maybe Japan was also eyeing Hawaii as, a place for them to set up business and sort of cultural and political ties. And so all of this came to a head when the Dole family decided that it was time to overthrow the queen and seize control of the island. With tacit support from some U.S. Marines, the Dole family, Sanford Dole, launched a coup to overthrow the queen and establish the, quote, independent Republic of Hawaii, following a tried and true pattern of overthrowing governments and establishing ostensibly independent countries that would later be integrated into the United States. So the Republic of Hawaii became a democratic republic, and they elected, quote unquote, Sanford Dole as as the president of the Republic of Hawaii. There was then a referendum amongst the Hawaiian people where they mostly protested and refused to recognize this government, which led to an international crisis because the Cleveland administration also refused to recognize the government without some measure of approval from the native people, leading to the Jingos being very upset because they saw Hawaii as a stepping stone to Asia. And so much like the Texas issues of the 1840s, Hawaii is going to sort of sit there as an ostensibly independent country, not recognized really by anyone, but attempting or having Americans lobbying for annexation into the United States. So Hawaii is going to sit there as a theoretically independent republic until later we decide that it's something that we want. The other problem is Cuba. Cuba is another island in which American investment was pretty vast. Americans had been establishing sugar plantations in Cuba, mostly absentee sugar plantations for a long time in this Spanish colony. And so there was a lot of American money and a lot of American vested interests in Cuba. At the same time, Cuba was still the jewel in or the pearl in the crown of the Spanish Empire. And Spain did not want to allow Cuba to become independent, so they were holding on to Cuba. But there was also a latent Cuban independence movement. And so you had this movement to try to overthrow the Spanish. And for the United States, this put us in a pretty difficult predicament because on the one hand, we didn't super support Spain controlling Cuba. We didn't really want Cuba to become independent because if Cuba became independent, then this would be a huge problem. Potentially all this U.S. investment could theoretically be lost. We definitely don't want Cuba to collapse into anarchy because that's, of course, going to destroy, a lot of this infrastructure and things like that. And we don't want Spain to sell Cuba to someone else because, that would violate the Monroe Doctrine. And so all of this really came to a head in the late 1890s. Specifically, when the Spanish brought a new general in named Victoriano Weyler to try to put down the Cuban revolt. He used traditional counterinsurgency tactics, basically putting people in concentration camps and then killing everyone who wasn't in the camp. This is sort of standard counterinsurgency because, of course, it's difficult to fight guerrilla irregular forces because they blend in with the population. So how do you do this? Well, you metaphorically drain the sea by putting everyone into these camps. But then, due to mostly logistical incompetence, the Spanish neglected to bring enough food for the people in the camps, leading to vast starvation. We sent a fact-finding mission to Cuba, and what we found is, again, massive amounts of starvation in these camps. And so you've got a combination of Cuban guerrillas burning down plantations, and at the same time, you've got starving Cubans in camps. This seemed to necessitate some sort of response for the United States, despite the fact that, this is theoretically Spain's territory, because both we have vested interest there, and of course, it's, right off our border. And so this made us super uncomfortable that this was happening. And so we more or less needed to do something, although there was huge debate as to what we needed to do. In the end, we decided to send the battleship Maine to Cuba in order to try to sort of normalize things, show the flag, demonstrate that the U.S. was paying attention to this. So the battleship Maine parks in Havana Harbor, and for a few days, it seems like everything's okay. We're able to provide some humanitarian relief. The Cuban rebels stop launching attacks, and then the Maine explodes. The explosion of the Maine created a massive international incident because the immediate assumption was that the Spanish destroyed the Maine in an attempt to hide whatever was happening in Cuba. Despite the fact that the Maine was there to restore order and to sort of assist the Spanish, there was this growing belief that it was somehow, the Spanish who blew up the Maine. The newspapers, specifically Pulitzer and Hearst, jumped on these stories in order to sell as many newspapers as possible. But the McKinley administration was much more measured about this. They set up an investigation. They set up a panel to investigate what happened. The panel investigated over a series of a couple months, and at the end they released a report that said it was probably an underwater mine that destroyed the Maine. They did not weigh in on whether or not the Spanish were, responsible for this, but all the same, the New York, all the papers had already stoked all of this anti-Spanish sentiment. And with a Senate report basically saying, yeah, the Spanish blew up the Maine, McKinley had no option but to declare war. And so we've got McKinley's war message. Take a moment, pause, and pull out McKinley's various reasons for going to war. And then we'll talk about the splendid little war. The Spanish-American War was kind of a mess for the United States. As we talked about before, the United States did not have a large standing army at this point, and so the mobilization process was kind of a disaster. We mobilized large groups of Buffalo soldiers who had previously been fighting Native Americans out on the frontier to go fight. And we also really struggled with logistics, getting enough horses, getting enough food, getting enough uniforms, finding enough transports and boats to get our people to Cuba. And so the mobilization process was a little bit problematic, probably the most problematic part of the war. We also had this weird sort of custom by which if you recruited a regiment of troops to go fight, a regiment of infantry or cavalry, then you could lead them as sort of a volunteer officer. And so the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, resigned from his commission as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, after sending orders to our fleet in the Pacific, which we'll get to in a moment, and recruited his famous Rough Riders. The Rough Riders were a group of Ivy League athletes, cowboys, and Native Americans, and they became the first volunteer cavalry department. Theodore Roosevelt then commandeered a boat by basically jumping on board it and sailing away with his Rough Riders. And that's how Theodore Roosevelt became an officer in the Spanish-American War. He recruited his own troop of soldiers, stole a boat, and headed off for Cuba. His expedition, like most of these expeditions, was just a comedy of errors. For example, all his horses died, and so the first volunteer cavalry became a cavalry without horses. And this was common for us trying to move any horses over to Cuba. In fact, it was said that you could see the path of the transports by following just the trail of dead horses that had been thrown overboard. Because again, logistically, we struggled to keep the horses cool. We struggled to keep the horses fed and watered. And the whole thing was spectacularly embarrassing. In the Pacific, the whole thing went much better for us. Theodore Roosevelt, as soon as war was declared, sent orders to Commodore Dewey to take our fleet out of Hong Kong and attack the port city of Manila in the Philippines. And so this is the first test for our new battleship fleet, and we performed absolutely admirably. The Spanish fleet at this point, Spain was economically a second-rate power. Their fleet was dilapidated and not in good condition. Reportedly, the coastal batteries in Manila Bay were the maintenance had been neglected so badly that they were more concerned if they fired them that they would explode as opposed to actually firing the shot outward. And so the Spanish admiral reportedly anchored his ships in shallow water because when they inevitably were sunk, then his troops would have his sailors would have a better opportunity to escape without drowning. And so all that was spectacularly humiliating for the Spanish, and our battleships performed admirably, obliterating the Spanish fleet with almost no casualties and capturing Manila Bay almost without any real trouble. So we literally obliterate the first Spanish fleet. Our invasion of Cuba goes really well, mostly because the Spanish guerrillas had already cleared out the landing ports. And so despite the fact that our transport, the whole moving people over thing was a disaster, we're able to get troops landed. We fight one really sort of important battle, the Battle of San Juan Hill. I mean, there's a number of other skirmishes that you can look up if you're interested. This is relevant because Theodore Roosevelt reportedly again, with the only horse that was still alive, helped lead the charge up San Juan Hill and defeat the Spanish. This was Theodore Roosevelt's crowded hour, and we'll spend more time talking about TR here. But this is his first opportunity to test himself in combat, which he really, really enjoyed. And we also, the Spanish sent a fleet from Spain to try to meet us, and this was terrifying because we were worried they might strike an American city or something like that. But in the end, the Spanish fleet just sort of meandered around the Atlantic until they ran into our fleet off the coast of Cuba and were obliterated. So we defeated 2 Spanish battleship fleets. We defeated the Cubans, won the Battle of San Juan Hill, captured the city of Santiago, and in the end, now we've got all of these Spanish possessions because after we defeat Spain, we decide that we're going to either declare independence for Spain's colonies or straight out annex them. Spain still had a series of colonies here, Puerto Rico, Cuba. Hawaii was still ostensibly independent. The Philippines was currently in revolt against Spain. And so there was a real question as far as what do we do with all of these territories? And so for Puerto Rico, we're just going to annex them. The Spanish-American War also pushed us to annex Hawaii because, we've got these overseas territories now. Hawaii's been pushing for annexation. It'd be really nice to have a naval base or a recoaling station there to be able to, get to Asia more easily. And so we're going to annex Hawaii, as the war is going on. The Philippines is more problematic because the Philippines had been fighting a pretty successful insurgent campaign against the Spanish, but at the same time, we'd really like to have those islands. And if they're independent, there's no guarantee that we're going to be able to use them to properly exploit the collapsing Qing dynasty, as we see here in this awesome Judge cartoon. And so we decide to not give the Filipinos independence. When they rise up against us, we have to start using some of the same counterinsurgency tactics that the Spanish used. Famously, General Jacob Smith orders an execution order for all Filipino men caught under arms, leading to a series of mass killings. We have some accounts of what happened in the quote-unquote Filipino War, which you should pause and read because they're pretty horrific. And in the end, mass killings of Filipinos as part of this war become pretty common, leading to some spectacular criticisms of President McKinley and some cartoons by people who've clearly never seen a Filipino. There's arguments for annexing the Philippines. Here's Albert Beveridge, his in support of American empire. So take a moment, pause, and read. So a lot of spectacular racism there. William Jennings Bryan is arguing, partially altruistically, that we should not annex the Philippines. But in the end, we decide to hold the Philippines as a territory because of its theoretical usefulness to us in the future. In Cuba, before the war, we passed an amendment saying that we would not annex Cuba and allow them to self-govern. But after the war, we helped the Cubans write a constitution that includes the Platt Amendment, which allows us to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever we want and gives us control of Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, which is going to be relevant later. So we're going to organize a temporary military government in Cuba, and they're going to become independent in that they're not under Spanish control and not technically under American control. But we approve or have to approve of every Cuban government going forward, and we're going to be approving a series of pretty brutal dictators to ensure our control over Cuba. So this vision of us moving Cuba towards peace and prosperity, we are going to restore order, and there's not going to be a major insurgent movement against United States rule in Cuba. There's not going to be a Cuban war to match the Filipino War. But as far as actually providing Cubans with self-government, it's very difficult to make that claim. So the results of this, the United States now has a pretty substantial overseas empire. Colombia here gets to try on her fancy battleship world power hat, and we've got some significant overseas territories. But there's a real question as to what happens to these territories, because we have a process for new territories to be incorporated in as states, but it's not totally clear that that's what we want to do with these new overseas territories. And so, but at the same time, there's no provision in the Constitution for us to permanently hold territories, in our thrall as, colonies or whatever. And so this is going to create a constitutional crisis. The election of 1900 is also sort of a reflection and a referendum on the Spanish-American War. McKinley is going to choose Theodore Roosevelt to be his vice president, partially because of his fame as both a jingo and as a soldier in the Spanish-American War, partially because the Republicans wanted to put him somewhere where he couldn't cause any trouble, and vice president seemed like a good role there, sort of a powerless job for Theodore, so he can feel important but not really do anything. Taft gets to be the governor of the Philippines, and we get an awesome picture of him on a water buffalo. But as far as the question about these territories go, it's still an open one. And the fate of the United States as an imperial power is still really up in the air. We've proven ourselves against a European power, the Spanish, and defeated them relatively easily. But where we go from here is very uncertain. So that's what we'll try to pick up next time as the United States grapples with the implications of the Spanish-American War and the acquisition of all these new territories. So we'll pick that up when I see you next. Thank you for listening.